And welcome again to our, well, we're calling it our summer series. Honestly, Lisa, I guess we're going to have to change that because we're starting to go into fall. One of the things I want to make sure to remind you of, and I'll do it once or twice, Lisa, and I can remind you periodically, is to go back to the EdTech Specialist website, click on that little icon that takes you to the competency webinars, and continually look at the updates. We're now up to 9, and in the next few days we'll be adding a 10th person, so I would encourage you to go back and look at that. Those of you who are viewing this in recorded version, if you're seeing a dark screen, I apologize for that. We're trying to work on that when we record from my computer. And we haven't got it figured out yet, but when we transition over, if you're not seeing it yet, you will. So I'm thrilled to be able to have Chris Sturgis with us today. I've had the opportunity to meet Chris, which is always nice when you get that face-to-face opportunity. And I will kind of introduce Chris more officially in a little bit. But I certainly want to thank you right off the bat, Chris, for being with us. And I will also, as you can see at the bottom of the screen here, I want to thank the sponsors who are really helping to support these efforts. Of course, one is EdTech Specialists, and Lisa and I are very proud to represent EdTech Specialists this morning. And we also have Michigan Virtual University. They are always, stepping up to the plate and supporting all the efforts that are important throughout Michigan. My Virtual Academy, likewise, they've been very great to really show their support for the various initiatives that are going on throughout Michigan, including being a part of some of those implementations across the state. And then the other sponsor is ThinkSpace, and this is a new conference center in Lansing. And I say conference center, and really it is really a center for creating conversations and ideas. It's a totally different space, if you will. One of the people many of you may know is Dave Seitz, and the other is Tracy Reel. They put it together, and I would encourage you to look that up if you're looking at any opportunities to bring small or medium-sized groups together. So we thank all of them for that. Lisa and I are, as I said, kind of facilitating here today, and Lisa Zipkins is also with EdTech Specialists. So, and I haven't seen if we have any other specialists on with us yet, but if we do, welcome them as well. One of the things that I want to make sure that we talk about is, the format today for asking questions. There are several different ways you can do that. You can put your question into the chat, and depending on how timely that question is, Lisa will jump in and ask the question of Chris, so that in case it's a time-sensitive question, we can get to that right away. Otherwise, we'll go back and review those at the end. But Chris is also available to have a back-and-forth, real conversation, voice conversation with you other than just chat. So if you would like to do that, if you would put that in the chat that you would like to talk with her, we will open the microphones and make that happen. So please be sure that you take advantage of that. Again, jump in. If you say that, we'll know that it's a time-sensitive opportunity for you, and we'll proceed. One of the other things I want to chat about real briefly before my formal introduction of Chris is that we're learning that, you can see here, many of you can see that although we don't have a lot of people attending live all the time, these are being recorded and archived on the EdTech Specialist website. And we're learning that there are districts across Michigan, and we hope this will be in other areas as well, who are beginning to look at these webinars in an archived version for professional development. And that's just a great idea. That's what I love about recording and archiving these, is that people have the opportunity to go back and revisit these. Because, as I was saying to Chris earlier this morning, the more I'm learning, the more I know I don't know. And I think that's kind of where we're all at, different stages of the early stages. But I think across the country, especially throughout Michigan, I think we're kind of in those initial embarking stages on a better understanding of what competency is, and perhaps what it isn't as well. So it's exciting to hear about that PD opportunity. So I hope that many districts will consider that. Chris, as I was reading through your bio again this morning, something that really struck me is, you know, all the various ways that you have created opportunities for students who need, you know, different kinds of options for learning. And reading through the various foundations that you've been involved with and that kind of a thing, I guess, as I introduce you officially, I have a couple of questions. Kind of in light of all that, in light of the work that you've done in the past, do you see competency as a, you know, kind of maybe a bigger opportunity than any other initiative you've been a part of before, or not? One of the other questions I have, and this one might come first, is that you are the founder of MetisNet. And I wonder if you could please kind of, you know, you can share a little bit about yourself as we start for those who haven't seen your bio. But I would like to know more about that myself. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Chris. I think that Lisa will then give you the presenter tool. I'll wait till she does that. And then we can transition directly over to you.
Great. So what Marcia is referring to is I used to work in, let me get this going, in foundations, and I worked at the Mott Foundation. I lived in Ann Arbor for a while, and I'm actually a Michigander summer person going to Frankfurt in July. And so I know the state a bit, but at Mott, I worked nationally, establishing multiple pathways to graduation as a policy that has been somewhat integrated into the education policies, but it's the idea that overage undercredit students, whether or not they're in school or have dropped out and need to complete their high school, is actually a function of the education system and not something that that we're not relying on the second chance system of employment as the only way for kids to connect and make the transition into their adult lives. And that's been a lot of the work I had done up until competency education. Competency education is definitely a much larger change, and we'll be talking about that, than anything trying to enhance or expand the traditional system. And then for everybody to know, so I have a small consulting firm, and it's called MetisNet, and the reason is that metis is a Greek word for local knowledge, and I really found working both in state government and in the foundation world that we tend to frame issues from our perspectives at higher levels of governance, and that in fact what's most important is to engage local communities and people on the ground doing the work in the conversation so that the issues are framed in a more holistic way than within silos. And I think that's a very important step, and that's consistent. And I'm sure part of the reason that competency ed resonates with me as well. So today, and I just want to say, it's such a nice sized group. Please just jump in and ask questions as I go along. So I was asked today to talk about the paper we just released earlier this month on implementing competency education in K-12 systems. And I'm focusing on the first two stages in this discussion. I'm prepared to go farther, but I feel that those are really the places where people have the most questions at this point. The way I structured this is with a three-part set of learning goals. One is to really talk about competency ed as a structure. And if people were on the session with Susan Patrick, this may be a duplication, but we'll spend some time on that to just talk quickly about the different four stages, and then we'll go into much more depth about the ramping up and then designing the infrastructure.
Hello.
Oh, okay, so for the working definition of competency education, this was developed with Susan Patrick, President INACOL, and myself, and 100 practitioners and policymakers that were actively working on competency education. And we call this a working definition because we believe that we are still learning and we may need to change it. It's holding up so far, could certainly do with a little tweaking, but in general, these 5 elements work together. And what I really want to, there's 2 misconceptions that I just want to talk about quickly and get those on the table. You often hear the phrase, learning is constant, time is a variable, which makes competency education sound like it's only about being self-paced or flexible pacing. And that is, in fact, a deep and huge misconception. The variable is that time, effort, and resources are variable, and that the pace and pacing matters. We never want to let kids just fall behind. They need to have extra help if they're not actually making progress. The other I want to just mention is that there's a difference between demonstrating mastery and simply completing something. And I think it's one of the issues that many of the online schools have had difficulty sorting through, which is completion at a lower level of depth of knowledge does not make it competency. And so I'm now going to go into that. So those are the 2 misconceptions. The students advance on demonstrated mastery. So that's 2 parts to that. One is we do not pass students along anymore with C's and D's and gaps in their knowledge and expect them to be able to be successful in their next grade level or course. And the other part, and which the virtual learning and blended online learning are so powerful, is that we want students to be able to advance beyond their grade level and be able to really soar. And we haven't seen that as much as we want to yet in a lot of the districts that have made the conversion. So part of the online capacity is going to be really important there. The competencies are transferable, they're explicit and measurable, is very, very powerful in the sense that the transparency is one of the big, big differences of the system. Students know what they're supposed to be working on wherever they are in their own individualized learning. And so that you may have, we all know the situation of 9th graders having skill sets that may range from gaps in 5th and 6th grade level, 7th and 8th, and you may even have students with 10th and 11th grade skills in your 9th grade. We have to make sure that students are getting the support and instruction where they are, not where we think they should be based on age-based grade. The students actually know what proficiency looks like, and that's really opening up this black box, this mystery, and that's one of the largest changes. And then they know what they're going to be assessed on. They have the rubrics up front. And that empowerment of students, the student agency we'll talk about several times, but that's one of the biggest changes. The assessment is meaningful and a positive learning experience for students means that the assessment is being done in a way that helps them to learn, which means it needs to be rapid feedback. Formative assessment is much more important. And we really do challenge the idea that students should be taking summative assessments on areas where we know they're not proficient. And that is one of the big changes for schools, is to try to think about how do you have just-in-time assessment rather than time-based assessments. Students receive timely differentiated support is absolutely imperative, and we see that a lot of schools in their first year forget to do this, and they have to change immediately. Honestly, it's making sure that during the day, not after school or at lunch, but during the day, students have time to work on the topics that are most challenging to them with teachers that can help them. And then the learning outcomes emphasize competencies that include the application and creation of knowledge, which means that we're aiming towards the higher levels of depth of knowledge taxonomies. Level 3, or I'm going to talk about, I'll use Webb's depth of knowledge taxonomy, so level 3 and 4, that's where we want to be aiming. And then we want to make sure that they're also developing the skills and dispositions, which people may call habits of learning, college and career ready skills, 21st century skills. But we want to make sure that students are learning those. And those skills are often what students need in order to have agency and be independent learners. So it's a very critical piece. So when we think about those 5 parts, what we're really thinking about is equity and excellence, And what's different about competency education is it's more granular. Right now, we think about proficiency in a very, I don't even know how to even, what the descriptive term might be, but we think of it as somebody not being proficient or being proficient. But in competency ed, we're thinking about, are students developing agency? Are they making progress? What's their pace, and is it a meaningful pace, and do we need to put more resources in to help them continue to either stay on track or get on track? And we're thinking about depth of knowledge. So let me just stop there. Are there any questions? Because what we really want to emphasize is this is a structure that would replace the traditional system and traditional structures. No questions? Okay. So over the past 5 years, I've been able to visit a lot of districts and schools, and through that research, was able to identify 4 phases of implementation. And Bob Crumley from Chugach School District helped me understand these 4 phases of implementation. And what it really starts with is a ramping up for transformation. And I will say this over and over in this, the one thing to take away is if this is not done well, I'm not sure the rest of the transition is able to really take hold. So it's absolutely critical. And then there's a stage of actually designing the infrastructure for learning. And that's where we deconstruct the traditional system and start to try to think about what is it we want kids to know, how are we going to structure that learning, how are we going to know that they are learning, and how are we going to communicate that. Then there's the transition, year or years, to competency-based systems. In general, this is primarily any type of change process requires this type of effort. There are elements that are unique to competency-based education. And then embracing continuous improvement and innovation is obviously the ongoing part. However, what I want to emphasize here is that because the information on student learning is more granular in competency education, it really enables a level of continuous improvement that is in the style of total quality management. It's a business practice, but allows a district to really focus not only on their students, but understand where teachers are having difficulties and may need extra help themselves. So the ramping up for transformation has 3 elements. The investing in shared leadership, constructing a shared journey of inquiry, and creating shared vision and shared ownership. You notice that word shared. We used it specifically because what we want to talk about is that this is it's a school-wide, district-wide, community-wide effort, and the focus is on mutual accountability and collaboration. We believe that this process is what helps us move from the compliance-oriented, top-down, bureaucratic structure of today's education system to one that holds the spirit of competency education. So what is the spirit of competency ed? This is not in the paper, and I'm trying to figure out exactly what this is. This is a trial for an idea. But I notice when I visit schools, some seem to have the spirit and some don't. And the quality of implementation, the morale, the delight in learning varies dramatically about whether or not schools have the spirit. So one is that there's just such a deep respect and such a deep sense of empowerment throughout the schools. The students feel more able to manage their own learning. They feel like they're getting help when they need it. They feel very respected, and that teachers are there to help them learn. The teachers feel empowered to work together to try new things, and they feel that they themselves are in a process of learning, and both are challenged by it and delight in it. The transparency, agency, and co-design, people will talk about it. Students will be talking about how they are learning, what they need to do next. They often have opportunities to think through what kinds of projects would allow them to both learn and be able to demonstrate their learning. The growth mindset and a flexible environment is huge in the schools that have the spirit of competency ed. And I actually picked this photograph of a little tiny plant coming between some boards because students learn no matter what, of course. But the growth mindset and being able to make sure that they have an environment that is working for them creates a much deeper responsiveness and flexibility on the part of the schools. Right now, when students don't do well in a comprehensive high school, they tend to drop out or are pushed out, and then hopefully we can get them to an alternative school that's designed around their needs. In the competency ed schools, there's much more of an ongoing dialogue about how might we create the environments where students would thrive. And then the last is a sense of moral purpose for all students to achieve, and on collaboration. There is a sense, I hear it consistently in the schools with the right spirit. Teachers will say one of the first changes we went to start to think about our students. And the teachers are really willing to work together, bring different teachers into their classrooms, group and regroup students in ways that make a difference to help them keep progressing. Any questions or thoughts, reactions?
Chris, this is Dave Richards. Can you hear me?
I can.
You know, Chris, I think, you know, being in the role of a superintendent who's tried to move a traditional school district towards competency-based, and that's why I just typed a couple of things in the chat room. The challenge is creating that healthy sense of urgency around the why, the need to change, especially in the high-achieving district. I think a lot of times there's a mindset that we're not broken, so, you know, why is there a need to go through this level of transformation? I would just love your thoughts on that growth mindset, especially in states where, you know, some of our teacher groups have had some hard times, getting cultures to that place where it's healthy and that there is a passion for taking back the conversation around learning, I think has been a big tipping point for us. But what is it that you've seen where districts have had the most traction in making or starting that transformation towards competency-based?
It's such a good question. So it's interesting. The group that is the least interested in competency ed are those students that are benefiting from the traditional system, who in a system that is not having high depth of learning, in a system that doesn't allow them to soar, a system that caps their learning, they get the highest GPA. And they are extrinsically motivated by those points. And when I visit any school, that top 10% has to find some way to be better than the other students, and it's uncomfortable. And so for the higher, I haven't seen high achieving, but higher achieving districts, they tend to want to try to be best. You know, they focus on the global challenge, and that their students aren't they really emphasize the students aren't competing against each other, that we're competing against other students around the nation and around the world. And so that you're trying to really emphasize basically building their resume as much as getting a higher GPA. So can you develop projects that would allow you to shine in your competition for colleges? They're still extrinsically motivated, right? And so I do think it is more challenging than for those districts who just find that they haven't been serving their kids well at all. The other part is that in any high achieving district, there's usually lesser achieving students, and part of that is to engage that community so deeply that you have enough public will behind, with you. I will try to find some of the districts. Sanborn, I believe, is one that was improving not because they were broken, but because they felt that it could help their students excel.
Okay. Yeah, any list of those would be fantastic. I appreciate it. Thank you for answering my question.
Yeah, sure. The Maine districts, by the way, you might also look at how Maine framed the state strategic plan, because Maine, there are some districts that are very rural and poor, but a lot of the districts that have been making this shift are kind of outer ring suburbs of the larger cities, and they're pretty intact schools and communities, but they still wanted to be better.
Right. Right. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not looking at the chat room, everybody. I can't multitask to that level. So, so the investing in I'm going to spend a little time talking about the investing in shared leadership. There's really these three parts. This is all in the paper: the distributing leadership, the creating a culture of learning, and empowering others. And we actually see that this is a huge shift for district and school staff, sometimes, not always, but sometimes. That distributed leadership, it is called different things: servant leadership, top-down, middle, management, adaptive leadership. And there are two things that they're really looking for in that is being the transparency and an inclusiveness. And the issue is, if you don't do this, it's going to actually both undermine the sense of mutual accountability, that ownership that people will develop around this, the students, and making sure that students achieve, and it will undermine your ability to make a learning culture. Because if the top levels of a district and school are the ones who are going to have to decide everything, then everybody turns to them for answers, and they don't seek out their own answers. And so it's a huge shift that's very, very important. That creating a culture of learning, one of the best places for that districts and schools find is to really create a open, facilitated process for meetings, so that anything that can be communicated by memo but that you focus on the deeper conversations always in dialogue, and that really fine-tuning the capacity of the school and the district to run effective interactive meetings is a key component of it. And then the empowering others, one of the big challenges here is, I've talked to a couple schools who tried to make this change, but they had not actually put the resources in place for the educators to be supported. And so they were trying to empower their teachers, but the teachers actually had very, very, very little meeting time, and they barely operated in terms of PLC, professional learning communities. And so I really think before you get going, you have to have the PLCs in place and a time for teachers to meet. I don't think people should start until they figure that out. Two books that people really refer to a lot here in making this shift is The Good Leaders Ask Good Questions by Maxwell and Building a New Structure for School Leadership by Elmore. So the constructing a shared journey of inquiry, it goes on with the school board. It's going to go on with your top district staff. You want to engage the principals, vice assistant principals in a process so that they can get their heads wrapped around this change before they're asked to bring everybody else in. And Tom Rooney from Lindsay, we were always asking, well, what was the sequence? How did you do things? And then we were walking down the hall during one of my visits, and he said, Chris, we really invested in the leadership of our staff, the management and leadership staff, early on in the process, and we often don't talk about that. And he really thought that this was a very important first step. A lot of people use different books or readings to have discussion groups. What are we learning? What does this make you think about? One of the key leadership functions that happen during the inquiry stage is that at some point a sense of urgency develops. And this goes to your question. As you start to read about the research on brain science and learning, all of a sudden you start to realize the schools aren't using everything we know about what works for kids. People start to feel bad. They start to feel ashamed often. They really want to start to change. And the leadership function is to be able to build on that sense of urgency, but not to swoop into change before you've really thought through what it's going to look like. And the other is to establish the learning culture where people can say, oh my gosh, I may feel kind of bad, but I just learned something, and that's really good. Because the teachers really start to realize that they have been using techniques that are not effective. So actually, I'm going to go back for one question. This stage is also where people start to understand the difference between student-centered and standards-driven. And it's very important to that culture of learning. Okay, so creating a shared vision and shared ownership. I'm going to talk quickly on this. The engaging community, two big points on this. Districts are really comfortable with buy-in models where you market an idea, you figure out the solution, and then you engage community. That does not work in this process. Community engagement really is much more interactive. There's much more of a dialogue. There's a process that they can contribute, and that you really start with the questions and not the solutions. And what we see is that this is where the shared purpose is developed. Here's a set of questions that are, every district uses slightly different questions, but they're in this genre. And they engage their community in doing so. And every district can tell you, if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have included X or Y. That the community will, in fact, shape a different shared purpose and values than you would educators would do alone. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, so here goes, we're going to go into this is where all the energy goes. So designing the infrastructure for learning. We now talk about it as an instruction and assessment model. That's just a phrase to try to capture it. But again, I'm just going to reiterate it. It's that ramping up that is the big, powerful change. But all the energy goes into this section, which is more of a technical change. So the first, we think 5 things that have to happen during this, and really rethinking and clarifying your own overall pedagogical approach is really important. Some districts know this, most actually cannot describe this very well. Investing in student agency, configuring the INA model, forging the policies and operating procedures for personalization is a big lift for most districts, and empowering teachers. So there is no right overall pedagogical approach, but districts really need to be able to answer these questions, and most importantly is for whatever group of students that is doing the least well in your district, low income, ELL, special education, African American, whatever that group is, figuring out what the research says to make sure that they are successful, and then integrating that into the core of your work is absolutely an essential step. We don't anticipate being able to fully address the equity issues if we continue to act as if those are marginal students. We have to put them in the core of the work. The investing in student agency is a developmental process. It doesn't happen in one month or 1 year. This is such a huge change from the compliance-oriented way that we have seen. We really have treated students as passive participants versus the agents of their own change. So I'm really encouraging people to say, not are you or are you not, but in what way is your system transparent to students and families and teachers? In what way and to what degree have your teachers been supported in developing and managing classroom structures for student agency? And in what way is student voice and choice embedded in your systems? And so one of the very simple techniques that we've seen over and over again is that teachers build a shared purpose, or a code of collaboration, it's often called, with each of their classes. And so that students also have voice immediately in the first days of school of shaping what the culture of that classroom is going to be. That really changes the dynamics. Also to make sure that as the system becomes transparent, students have some choice about how they learn, what type of instructional modality, and in what way they're going to demonstrate their learning. It doesn't have to be all the time, but that's a very simple step in terms of being able to, I shouldn't say simple, but it's an important step in being able to change that classroom. And then I would really encourage people to think of students as assets during the transition stage itself. So configuring the instruction and assessment model, the big question, what do you want students to know and be able to do? We've got Common Core, we've got state standards, but you also want to be able to identify those habits of learning, lifelong competencies, whatever those larger dispositions and process skills are. You want to think about them developmentally. Are they going to be the same in elementary school as they're going to be in high school? You want to be able to think that through. That becomes transparent. There is still discussion. There is no right answer about how to construct competencies compared to standards. There's a lot of discussion right now about granularity. How do we make it all meaningful for students and teachers? What are the implications for assessment? This is not a simple answer, and I hope in the next year or two we should be able to at least be able to understand the implications. But in general, the competencies are those big essential ideas that you want students to be able to do even when they don't remember the details of the specific standards. So they're the big takeaways that they should be able to apply to different contexts. You can look at New Hampshire created some statewide competencies in partnership with their districts. It was not done as a statewide function, but one that was co-designed. And then schools tend to focus in on power standards. There's so many standards. If you were trying to assess by every standard, you would just spend so much time. And so schools are trying to figure out how do we do this in a way that's most meaningful to the learning process. And then I consider this creating a common language and structure to be able to guide instruction and assessment. And first of all, districts need to have a knowledge taxonomy. It might be Bloom's, Revised Bloom's, Marzano-Kendall, depth of knowledge. They're all slightly different. They all have slightly different purposes, but they create a language about what depth of knowledge students are operating at. And one of the things that schools find out really quickly is that most districts, there's much more emphasis on recall and comprehension than there is on the higher order skills. And that immediately begins a process of how do we improve our instruction and how do we strengthen our assessment capacity to have higher emphasis on performance-based assessments. And this is also another way to engage the higher learning, the higher achieving students, because I can speak personally. I was a kid who could take a test, no problem, but applying those skills was always a whole different level for me and much more challenging, but also always much more fun and engaging for students. The units of learning, again, this goes back to how you structure the overarching competencies and standards. There's different ways of organizing this. Right now, we're still doing it within silos of disciplines. There's an effort called Learning Progressions, which is researchers looking at how students actually learn and then organizing units of learning best around how students move from one concept to the next. And that is an important step to consider over time. The rubrics and calibration, so one of the big changes is not every individual teacher having their own rubric. So if you're teaching algebra, then there should be similar rubrics across algebra. And the big change is teachers should be determining what proficiency is in very similar ways, which is this process of calibration is one of the most important steps to making the transition. How do we make sure that teachers really understand what proficiency is so that it's consistent and that they can explain it also to students? And then the habits of learning I mentioned before, this is very highly related to that student agency and being able to talk about these and be clear about what they are is an important step. Some people use the phrase non-cognitive. I think that that's not a useful phrase. there is also right now a lot of discussion on all these different skills that aren't academic, and we're probably going to have to, I think about these in subcategories, because grit is not the same as communication. They're not in the same category of types of skills or dispositions. And so we need to think very clearly about this. And it's a process for the whole field. The forging policies and operating procedures for personalization. Okay, so I would say this is one of the bigger sets of changes for districts. So as you start to move forward, how are you really going to think about student agency? What do you want consistently across your district and schools? And then what can vary according to different teachers? And how are you going to support teachers in being able to nurture student agency? What are the skill sets they need? Lindsay Unified, I think hopefully in the next year, we'll be releasing a set of adult competencies that students need, or teachers need, and we included in a sample of that in the paper. A big one is to really think about levels, pace, and progress. So right now we talk about grade levels, and it's fine to keep grade levels in competency-based schools. That's not a problem, but you're really talking about an academic level. And then you need to differentiate when a class is organized around a grade and it's going to be heterogeneous skill sets in there, and when students are really having to work at their specific academic levels. A big part of the transition is having that first conversation with students and parents about where students really are and being honest about that. And then you very quickly shifted, and this is what we're going to do, especially when students are significantly behind. Talking about pace, the word pace is a fascinating word, like grade. It has multiple meanings. So you want to be able to talk about pace as what is the individual pace a student is learning at, but what do they really need to be? What is the trajectory they need to be on if they want to be on track, stay on track? Or if they want out of high school faster, what is that pace that they need to be able to be moving through? You'll want language about progress. And this is the big one. How will you communicate student progress? In other words, grading. We do not recommend that schools lead with grading. We don't think it helps. And one of the big misconceptions is the difference between standards reference grading and standards based grading. And it's important to note this and know which one you're using, regardless which way you're calling it. The standards reference grading refers to using the standards to say what students have learned, but they still continue to pass students on to the next grade level without actually learning all the standards. It's just using the standards within the grading process. Standards-based grading or competency-based grading is about making that commitment to not yet proficient. That we're going to talk to students about that they're not there yet, and there is going to be a process and resources available to help them become proficient. This is probably the biggest change for districts and schools. How are you going to build in that capacity for when students need more help? And then advancing upon mastery, again, it goes back to, do you have adequate supports to make sure every student can master? And what is needed to be in place for students to advance beyond level. I'm talking about high achieving districts again. Being able to advance beyond level, beyond their grade level, is certainly a way to replace the need to be better than the other kids. So if every 10th grader has a chance to operate and learn at 11th grade, there'll be competition to do that. What you want to guard against is students starting to talk about themselves as a fast learner or a slow learner. That is just the same as dumb and smart, or dumb, yeah. And so you want to really guard against that, because that is the antithesis of a growth model. A growth model is that we all take the time we need to be successful. So the one thing I don't have on this is how much time has gone by. So let me just stop. Oh, empowering teachers, we talked about it, must have strong PLCs, and that during the transition process, not in the first year, but during the transition process, the districts do begin to align their human resources system around the empowering teachers. and teachers having autonomy and creativity. The professional development often starts to become embedded because the teachers are actually demanding that they need to build up their assessment literacy and their instructional toolkit. That becomes so important for them. It becomes a very natural process. Let me stop. Questions, discussion. We have such a nice group.
I'll just step in for a second, Chris. This is Marcia. Dave, you shared another resource with us, so I'm backtracking for a second, and then we can go forward again. And Lisa reminded me that although a lot of you can see that as you're participating, those who are viewing the recording wouldn't. So it is Managing Transitions, Making the Most of Change by William Bridges. And Dave, you wrote that it gets to the human side of transitions. So that's another resource that, along with the one that Chris shared on her slides. Getting back to our participants, is there anyone who has any question? You can put it in the chat. You can ask right out loud. Whatever you want you to participate would be great.
Well, can I just ask Dave, so you put all these questions, spirit, shared vision, understanding, culture of innovation. So I'm just curious what you were responding to or thinking about when you wrote that note.
Well, you know, it was really that challenge of the spirit around competency-based and having shared buy-in, not buy-in, the level of commitment that you need to do the work. And you know, depending upon the size of your school district, and if you're truly looking at it as a systemic change, that requires a great deal of effort and consistency to create that culture where people understand the need to go through that transition. The book that I had put in to the chat is one that we've really used because it talks about, you know, in order for there to be a new beginning, you have to have an end. And in many cases, when you're transforming a traditional school system to a competency-based system, there's some grieving that goes on with what people feel they may be giving up before you can begin what that new environment and new culture looks like. So it's one that we've worked with our principals a lot on, and recognizing where people are at emotionally and mentally as they go through this conversion until that light goes on and they understand the need to do this. Yeah.
You know, I was speaking with someone who started up a new school that with competency ed at its core, and it's somebody who deeply understands competency education. So she's showing the school district that they work with and in the data on their 9th grade students, and it's a school district that really fails to teach about 50% of their students. And so the district person said, well, what are you going to do about all these 9th graders who are reading at 5th and 6th and 7th grade level? And the principal or the founder of the school turns to her and she's like, well, we can tell you because we're taking it on, but the question is, what are you doing? And one of the issues that comes out in competency ed is everything becomes explicit and transparent, all the issues, right? It's right there in front of you as you face up to it. And part of that process is engaging people to reflect back on the traditional system and not let the worries of the competency ed system be the only point of discussion, because it's much easier to let go of a system when you realize it's not working very well.
Yeah.
But it's great when you're like, well, we have all these 9th graders and they're all progressing, but are they really, right? Because people, if you don't know what level they're at.
Right.
Then,
you know, one of the things I would say that we really have tried to focus on is not wrapping the conversation around the fact that our schools are broken, but it's more our theories on learning need to be evaluated and to really talk through that, because the goal isn't to dismiss what we've been doing as you know, we've been failing kids, even though the conversation, it's a slippery slope we could end up there, but it's more talking about, are we providing what our students today need? And given the new realities of education and learning, what do we need to do to be viable moving forward? And I think that kind of builds the organizational energy that you need and rallies the staff more than, just simply pointing out all the brokenness that we see, and that is there. So.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's a good point about having to design around where your own district is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
If I was to rewrite the paper, I would make a section on that now, but I didn't do that. But that's a really good point. Okay, any other thoughts or questions? Okay. Marcia?
Okay, Chris, are you, you're all set then? I didn't know if you wanted to add anything else.
No, this was great. I'll just go quickly to the, there's at my email if anybody wants to follow up.
Perfect. There are a lot of people saying thank you in the chat right now, and certainly I'm one of those people. We really appreciate your time, your expertise, your experience, because this is going to be one of those webinars that we will go back and revisit many times, depending on what stage our thinking is at. I wanted to, again, remind everybody to go to the EdTech Specialists website and look at the upcoming schedule. July 13th is our next one with Rose Colby, and Rose has written a book that I think that we mentioned there, and she'll be talking about that with us. And it's a good read. I recommend it to all of you prior to the webinar if possible. And then on August 3rd, Dave Richards. You just heard Dave having some conversation with Chris, and he will be our presenter. And we're really looking forward to that because that's one of our homegrown. So Dave, we're looking forward to having you with us as the presenter. So thank you all very much. If anyone has any questions, you can see that Chris has her contact information, and you can also contact me or Lisa or any of us, and we'll be happy to guide you or connect you or anything that you request. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marcia.
Sure. Thank you all. Thanks, Chris.